Good morning. Like this. And if you don't mind, if you're comfortable, please come forward a little closer, because we're going to have a dialogue with you all, and we like you to be a little closer so we can hear you, and more importantly, so you can hear each other. So please come forward if you can. Good morning, I'm Bernie Demchuk, and I'm a professor of African American history and culture, retired from GW, but also I'm Ben's Chili Bowls historian. And a shameless plug, I just released my new biography on Ben's Chili Bowls, Virginia Ali. Anybody ever heard of Ben's Chili Bowl? If you haven't heard of Ben's Chili Bowl, you need to leave.
You need to leave, yeah, that's a good idea.
This is a historiography of D.C., Black D.C., and Virginia is stuck right in the middle of it, looking out her window from her grill on U Street. Thank you all for being here this morning. What a great start with Sydney. And here's how I'm going to do this. I'm going to introduce each panelist, and I'm going to give them a moment to say a little bit more about themselves. Then I'm going to ask them each a question about their current books, and then we're going to do Q&A. We're going to concentrate on history. We'll do a Q&A for about 30 minutes, and then we're going to ask you for comments and or questions to us. And at the very end, we're going to ask Janetta Rose Barris to give us commentary on what we said and did, and then we'll do closing comments. So thank you for all of that. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. Janetta, this is a very historic moment. History is everywhere, but this is an important thing. We're so glad you got it on tape. Our theme today, removing the mask, amplifying the voices. The struggle for Black authors to get their stories for children depicting authentic African American life, history, and culture published in the mainstream. In the year 2000, University of Wisconsin's Cooperative Children's Book Center reported that only 3 of children's books printed that year had Black characters. That's only 17 of 5,000. By 2019, that number rose significantly. 12% in 2019 of children's books with Black characters, but only half of those had Black authors and illustrators. Clearly, we're moving in the right direction. We're now fearing, of course, that reading books is becoming less and less important and popular because other entertainment venues are taking over. So this is very essential that we get ourselves organized to continue to promote this subject. We're going to concentrate on history this morning, and our 3 panelists. Dr. Colivia Herron is a creative writer and professor in the English department of Howard University. She is also the host of Epic City, 94.3 FM, and director of Street to Street Epic Center Stories in reading the classics and creating community classics in Tacoma Park, Maryland. She is the author of the very popular 1997 children's book, Nappy Hair, still selling strong today. Please welcome. Please make sure everybody sees it. Promote it. Excellent, excellent.
Thanks.
You want to say anything else about yourself, Dr. Herron?
Oh,
Please.
I thought you were doing the introduction.
We are, but let's say something if you want.
I think that's fine. I'd love to talk about the controversy. Oh dear. We're going to talk about it as we go through the history of the fight we had to go through. That's what this is about. It's about fighting. And even after getting a contract with Random House and having to fight to get what you want said, and having contracts with like Farrar, Straus and Giroux, which I had to turn down because they told me I didn't know what black people talk like, you know, that kind of thing. But I don't want to.
We'll get to that.
Yeah, we'll get to
That's
that,
exactly
yeah.
where
Let's
we
go
want
back.
you to go.
Yeah,
Dr. Wynne Yarborough, Professor of Composition, Children's Literature, Technical and Creative Writing, and British Literature at the University District of Columbia. His academic research is in pedagogy and curriculum in anthropomorphic tales, gender, and African American children's poetry. He's the author of Masculinity in Children's Animal Stories from 1888 to 1928. He is a longtime member of the Children's Literature Association. His newest book is African American Children's Poetry, Representation and Themes. Welcome, Dr. Yarborough. What else would you like to add, sir?
I'm just thrilled to be here, to be honest. It's, you'll be my first. How's that? My book is going to be published, I think, at the end of March. So this is the first time I'll actually be talking about it before conferences and all that stuff. So I did not know that who I would be sitting next to either. And then I didn't know I'm going to be speaking about some of your mother's work. So I'm sort of like going, somebody could have told me at like 6 this morning, just to kind of, but I'm really glad to be here. Thank you so much again.
And of course, our commentator, you know her,
Janetta.
Rose Barris.
Thank you, Joe.
Janetta is an author, a teacher, an essayist, a poet, and a general agitator. Agitates me often in promoting African American children's literature. She is the visionary curator for this symposium today. She's a hard-hitting reporter and frequent critic of DC politics and government. She is the co-founder of the Institute for the Preservation and Study of African American Writing and a contributing author of poetry in numerous poetry journals. And she is the daughter of the great state of New Orleans.
Well, it's not a state, it's
I know, that's why.
it's like it's not a continent, right? It's not a country, it's a
That's
continent.
why I
right?
said
See what I'm saying?
New Orleans is separate in and of itself. It's a city that is, in fact, itself civil disobedience. That's a joke. Let me go back to our two distinguished panelists. Dr. Herron, tell us more about your work this is fascinating to me. Tell us more about your work in classic literature, and how can the classics be used to inspire African American children's literature? And tell us what classics is anyway.
Oh, for heaven's sakes,
'Cause
please.
I-
No, we don't want to stay here all day. Come on. But yeah, I'm sorry. I don't mean to interrupt you like that. Let me just preface it by saying, when I was a little 4, 5, 6-year-old, my father used to march up and down the floor reading to me and declaiming, and he would read speeches of Frederick Douglass followed by passages from Herodotus. So I thought Herodotus of 5th century BCE was the twin brother of Frederick Douglass. I had no idea there was any difference whatsoever, and I grew up thinking of that all going in together. And that I think you can see in my work today. I was actually hired at Howard in the classics department. They got rid of the classics department and spread us all around. We were a little bit upset about that, but we're actually infiltrating the entire university, so that's okay too. What caused me to actually publish my book, Nappy Hair, the book that's gotten me into more trouble than I've ever been in my life, was teaching a course at Harvard University on epic poetry. And most people think that I wrote this book in order to help people to love their hair. I'm glad they love their hair and all that, or we love our hair, but that was not the reason. I was trying to explain to my students that epic poetry, oral poetry had not died. That black people, my Uncle Richard, every summer at the picnics tells stories, oral stories all day long. And they didn't believe me. So I had the summer off, of course. I came home and I had a party, a picnic. My uncle told the story about how I got my nappy hair. I recorded it, got back, transcribed it, and when at Harvard, in the oral poetry department, essentially, they said that nobody on earth does oral poetry anymore. It's gone, it's dead. So I played my uncle's recording, and I don't know how many, just a line or two. Brenda, you sure do got some nappy hair on your head, don't you? Well, your hair, Brenda, take the cake, yep, and come back and get the plate, don't you know? Well, that's how it goes back and forth with the call and response. And this was really happened, and I recorded it, I transcribed it, and after I transcribed it, I recognized patterns of speech that could be compared to Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. For example, this is the most important piece that I've quite frankly, I was just trying to show oral poetry. I wasn't trying to make it look like Homer or anything, but I discovered that there was a formula my uncle used when he couldn't think of what to say next. He used a formula, and I can't even find the page, of the blues. He used African American form of the blues to, and what is wrong with me today? I know you're here because I wrote it. Here it is. Well, my character is back in Africa and getting ready to come to the United States, bringing her nappy hair with her. At that point, in the actual telling of the story, my uncle wanted to go back and eat his hamburger. He was sick of the story, but the people demanded, "No, Rich, come on, brother, you got to keep on telling this story." And it's like, I had the recording, and he said, "Sold your mama for a nickel, and your daddy for a dime. So, sold your mama for a buffalo, and your daddy for one thin dime." Well, he didn't sing it, but when I transcribed it, I realized it was the blues stanza. Sold your mama for a nickel, and your daddy for a dime. Well. I say they sold your mama for a buffalo, and your daddy, they sold him for one thin dime. So he was using a method that the epic scholars of Europe had decided was only seen in Iliad and the Odyssey and books like that. And basically, I was realizing that this is human. When you run out of something to say, you figure out. We are professors. We know how to do that, right? We come up with something to say, and I started analyzing it. So that's one of the ways in which I used it. Anyway, just going on. I don't know how much time I'm rushing because I feel like I want to get my story in here. I'd already published a book with Random House, which is an adult novel, so I won't go into that. I want to go into the children's part. And I called up my editor at Random House and said, who at Random House would be interested in this children's book? What happened, I was going around the city here in D.C. sharing my first novel, Thereafter Johnny. And I was at the Anacostia Museum. Well, Thereafter Johnny, I love the book, but it's not happy. It doesn't have a happy ending. It was a sad story. And I was at the Anacostia Museum, and I said, I can't leave here with a sad story. So I actually had, in my briefcase or something like that, it was still in papers like this. Let me read you just something that I transcribed for my class up at Harvard. And I read this story, and they were all clapping with me, and then we go with the back and forth, and yes, you got the nappiest hair in the world, well, and all that kind of stuff. And they said, well, why didn't you publish that one? And it's like, I hadn't thought, I was using it as a lesson, but it hadn't occurred to me to publish it. So I called my editor. She told me to send it to Simon Bolton and the children's division. He was in charge of the children's division at Random House. He's from England. Yeah, no, the word napping in England means diaper. He had no clue what napping meant. And he told me he was sitting in his office one day, and his secretary, his assistant, he heard her break out laughing and couldn't stop laughing. So finally he came out of his office and said, what are you laughing at? And she handed him the raggedy papers in those days of nappy hair. And he read it, he liked it, and he actually accepted it. It's the only thing I felt like I don't belong in this conference because it's the only thing I've ever published the first day it arrived at a publisher, was this book, Nappy Hair. But I'm convinced that it's because he was from another culture, he had no clue what nappy would mean in the United States, and because of his secretary, a black woman, was laughing so hard at it. And even though it didn't have trouble getting accepted, the problems of the publishing problems that Jonetta has been referring to and Sydney, if I may, forgive me, call you Sid, existed with this book, and within that was 1997 before it got published, and it was banned across much of the United States. And let me give a shout out to the librarians. Any librarians here? Thank you. The librarians refused to stop ordering it. And the more it got banned, the more the librarians kept ordering them. And because of that, it hit the bestseller list. Before the controversy occurred because a white teacher in New York City taught this to her African American and Latinx students, and the parents didn't like that. They didn't like the word nappy. They said it's using black English and blah, 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 blah. And she got chased out of the schoolroom, and New York State banned the book first, and then the banning went around. You can ask more questions later.
Nothing better than to have the establishment ban your book.
Yeah, well,
then it will sell.
But I have to say, it doesn't feel good. In spite of it selling, it still doesn't feel good. I just have to tell you that before the banning, I had sold about 12,000. After the banning, it went to 125,000
Wow.
in 1 week. Anyway.
I was fearful in the last couple of weeks. We've been talking about what Dr. Heron was going to say. And she says, I don't have much to say. Hello. Thank you. I'm going to take a moment of personal privilege. I've always wanted to ask this, and I never figured out where I could ask this other than this group. I'm of Polish-Ukrainian descent. Am I allowed to ask you or say to you, I love your nappy hair? Am I allowed? No? Shake your head, no.
No, this is what
I know not to ask you to touch it. I know that part. but I'm not allowed to say that? Okay.
No. If you have not, if nappy is not a normal part of your conversation, you don't start using it now. That's what I start off my talks with. If it's not already a part of your world, then leave it alone.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Dr. Yarborough, you have a new book coming out, Children's Literature and Poetry. Tell us a little bit, please, and give us a little history of how this comes about.
Let me just say that what you just said is kind of right in the middle of many of the themes that are in my book anyway. So I organized my book around, it all started with the Children's Lit presentation where I was an invited speaker to talk about curriculum. And what I went into it going, I was a high school teacher for 6 years, and for the life of me, I could not understand why you studied American literature as a 16-year-old and British literature as a 17-year-old. It did not make any sense to me, because the idea was I was supposed to make you a better writer and reader, and all I did was give you Chaucer and Milton. You see what I'm saying? It's like, it doesn't match. And someone who's kind of curious, I don't always...
You better leave Milton alone. That's my favorite.
I know, you're going to jump me. I know you're going to jump me. I'm not, I'm somebody that tends to think that if there's something I see and it doesn't look right, then I'm going to try to go down the rabbit hole. And so I really went down the rabbit hole of educational psychology, cognitive development, and really by the time I finished my Children's Lit article, I was telling them, I was like, look, spoken word, jazz poetry, these better fit the modalities of the teen brain and the brain as it's developing and language acquisition and all of that. So it's interesting to me when you're talking about the oral qualities of your book, I'm going, that's the ball field we want to be playing in, really. So my book ended up being about like some themes. I did take a look at labor. Representation of labor in children's poetry is a rare thing. It is part and parcel of African American children's poetry. Very big, and in that, quote, difference, going back to my Children's Lit field and scholars there, I'm like, you probably need to either wash the board clean and start again, or start to make significant examination of these types of tropes, because they run throughout. The influence of the blues in African American children's poetry is quite prevalent, and in particular in Lucille Clifton's work. The stanzas are blues stanzas. They're not kind of uses and all that's kind of like it. Not in Everett Anderson. And then the other parts I looked at was the influence of jazz, masculinity and femininity. I know I use these old-fashioned sort of terminology, But the work that I was doing was looking at works from basically like the 1920s up to like the 1990s, maybe 2000 with Harriet Mullen. And then I also wanted to take a look at nonsense, which was a big one. In my field, children's literature, nonsense is the apex of Anglo-European wit. Do you see what I'm saying? Alice in Wonderland. Oh, it's the greatest children's work ever. It's like, yep, how many kids have read it? And so what I sort of figured out was like, look, I'm just going to look back through and figure out where these instances of nonsense that I saw occurred in African-American children's poetry and then try to trace it back. And that to me, like if I never did anything else in my life, ever again, scholarly, that chapter in and of itself was the best thing I could have done for myself as a human being. Because I knew the idea was there, and I was at the Whitney Plantation down in Louisiana, and
My
there's
ancestors were enslaved there.
there was a memorial, and from the remember I'm on painkillers right now, so the Works Progress Administration paid people to go around and collect the stories of former slaves. Francis, what was their last name now? Told the story of playing Ring Around the Rosies, Ring Around the Rosie with the kids on the plantation. That right there sent me to UT's library in Austin, pulled out those narratives, and then started tracing my way back from received nonsense through slavery and partial literacy. And then I went further back and looked at West African uses of animals and animal stories that made its way into the field songs and hollers in African American musical history from the South. So I just feel incredibly lucky, and as I tell people, I think like if you find an instinctual thing, I pray that there'll be more African American children's scholars, that you really follow it, and your instinct's probably not going to fail you if you're going after it for the kind of the right reason. I would say, and just to finish off, is that African American children's history has had a little bit of a sort of stain on it because people, it seems to me, were reluctant to engage in that scholarship because it felt like it was infantilizing African American literature as a whole. We're past that now. Do you know what I mean? We're past that. So that the richness and the treasures that are in there, I'm laying bare one sort of template. There's a way more work to be done there. Yeah.
Thank you, Wynn, thank you. You touched on the next question to both of you, and that is, how far does African American children's literature go back? Can we trace it to the 19th century or the 18th? How far does it go back, and can you all help with that question?
I mean, like for my research, I just told you one story right there. I would say you got to, and when we talk about children's literature, the word literature to nowadays means anime, spoken word, TikTok. Do you see where I'm going? So if you go backwards into African American children's literature, it's going to be the first scream that's echoed by a child in pain, duress, whatever, in the United States, because that's where it starts.
Excellent.
And then songs, games. The book I'm going to recommend if you want, it's on Amazon, it's free. It's by Thomas Talley, 1922, Negro Rhymes and Otherwise. And they are, it's free, Thomas Talley. And it basically covers all these hunting songs, games that kids would play, rhyming songs. Some of them have morals, some of them have warnings in them. But that, to me, Talley collects that in 1922. He's at Fisk University, but those songs are way older than 1922.
Yep.
Yeah, it's strange. We both started to talk at the same time, and you took it away, which is wonderful, because I was guessing, and what I was guessing at was what you just said. It's a strange sense of, oh, really? I've been commissioned to write a play about my ancestors, my enslaved ancestors, and I've been trying to do exactly what you were saying. What kind of literature? What kind of story? And all I could come up with was the clapping songs.
Right.
Here comes Sally, Sally, Sally. Here comes Sally all night long. I'm thinking, I heard that when I was a child. My mother heard that all the way back, and I ended up placing in this story of my ancestors, essentially the game songs
Right.
and there's a plot. If you listen to remember enough of them, there's a plot, there's a story behind it. I'm sorry, I don't mean to.
So.
Absolutely. Can I throw one
Go-
more
No,
thing in,
please,
too?
please do.
Yeah, I was going to say, again, think about Children's Lit and keeping in mind, and this is a DC thing that I think I know just from teaching at UDC. One of the things I used to do when I was teaching Children's Lit is I would have them tell me a ghost story. It's like you're going to write a ghost story and they're going to tell the class about it. There are plenty of ghost stories around DC. That has not been tapped in some ways I think it could be tapped into. Just going to throw that out there. But I was just going to throw out that another sort of thing to think about is like jump rope songs.
Yes.
So like one of the things in the Children's Lit collection, I'm sorry, we're in a hallowed space here, but to do it justice, basically it's 2468, we ain't gonna integrate. 8462, bet you sons of bitches do. And so that kind of song was being sung on playgrounds in Texas in the early 60s. And so that in and of itself, I think, tells you not only is it, you got to think about Children's Lit, it's not what they receive, sometimes it's what they're creating and pushing back, like what they see in the world and then what they're pushing back out to the world. They call it recyclopedia, or Harriet Mullen has a term she calls recyclopedia, where you recycle something and then also put some more knowledge or context or experience into it.
So it's not necessary to stretch the imagination to say, in fact, children's literature goes back to the 18th century with hymns, and it goes through the 19th century with Negro spirituals, and then certainly into the 20th century with gospel music. Is that true? Is that accurate to say?
I would say so. We would say maybe the first published African-American poet would be Phillis Wheatley, and that's in the late 1800s.
Mm-hmm.
And then it quickly takes off, but these are writers that, I don't want to say were buried, but they certainly weren't illuminated. But there are many slave narratives and some fiction comes out of the early 1800s, before the Civil War in the North.
And in 1746, there was Lucy who wrote and published a poem called Bar Fights. That was in 1746.
Yeah, it's actually
She
Phyllis was not
predates Mrs. Wheatley.
Yeah, there are 3 or 4 poems, but not a book.
Yeah, right,
She's the first book, not the first poem.
Yeah. Thank you. The Brownies book, moving into the 20th century. W. Du Bois, Jesse Fawcett in The Messenger, the Brownies book, Stories of Children of the Sun. Can you tell us a little bit about that, when, and could you tell us what happened to it after 1921, 22?
I think a couple of things might have happened. They probably kind of ran out of money because it's an expensive venture. But the bigger deal is that the Great Depression comes along. And with that, the Red Scare kind of later. So it's like the early decade of the 20th century is the time for ideas. In the second decade, 10 through 20, you can start to do those ideals. And then after that first 2 decades, it sort of cuts off because of the economic circumstances. It seems to me that the Brownies book is one of those books that does really well. And Du Bois was, people say genius, but he was a genius with a purpose. And part of the purpose was not to be didactically sermonizing down to children. If you look at the way the Brownies book was laid out, it's a multi-tiered audience. He's going for the adults, he's going for the kids, he's going for recent Caribbean emigres, so they really have it down. And the different sections, whether it be like Proverbs or, hey, this section's for the parents, I'm just talking to them, like he's spaced that out, or they spaced that out. And I'm sorry, I forget the woman's name who actually is the editor, Jessie Fawcett?
Jessie Fawcett, yeah.
Yeah, I think that she deserves a lot of credit, and she's probably one of those people that, my job is to get people to come do children's literature scholarships, so I'm just giving you the ideas And then later on, you email me and you're like, can you read my dissertation? And I'll be like, okay, yeah, I'm the dummy who said do this. She might be someone that's worthwhile taking a deep dive, scholarly speaking down.
Good, good. So you now just entered into the next question. Jesse Fawcett, Angelina Grimke, Georgia Douglas Johnson. Now we're in D.C. Renaissance. The D.C. Renaissance often inspired much of those personalities in the Harlem Renaissance, 1919 and 1935. D.C. Go ahead, Dr. Herron.
You didn't mention Angelina Weld Grimke was going to be a part of the questioning. I published the only collection of her work. Here, I told you I had nothing to talk about, and then you didn't tell me what
I didn't know I was going to say her name until
well,
just now.
You just said it, and I was like, oh, now I have something to talk about. Anyway.
Go ahead, go for
Yeah,
it.
I guess Oxford University Press published a 40-volume set of, they called it 19th century African American women's writings, but of course it went into the 20th century, and Angelina Weld Grimke was one of the volumes, and I edited that one, and I sat in the basement underneath. It felt like Moreland Spingarn room for months. I look over at Ethelbert because you know what it's like, going through her handwritten letters and papers and develop that, her writing, not only the black finger, why black finger, why are you black and why are you pointing upward? One of the chilling, beautiful lines that from one of her poems. And also, many of her poems had her love poems had two versions, quite often. The first one, handwritten in with the she to she, woman to woman love. And then when published, it was became heterosexual poetry. That's just one of, but I love her. She's someone that I read children's books over and over and over again, and I love her youth poetry very much.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you for getting excited about one person. That's
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, what did she was
Please do it. The themes, the issues being discussed in this literature in the late 19th century and during the Harlem D.C. Renaissance. Now, notice I always say D.C. Renaissance. Do not leave out the D.C. Renaissance when we talk about Harlem. What are the themes? What are the issues? What are people writing about for children in particular?
I think, if you want me to throw something in, is I think that one of the majority theme that seems to emerge in a lot of children's poetry in that time period is basically love, like a love of self, because you're countering so many negative messages and so many negative stereotypes. So like you said with the use of the word nappy, it's like a war on words and war on images in many ways. One thing I would say is that, because of DC's early migration patterns to DC, the establishment of an intelligentsia and some semblance of middle-class wealth, DC was quite different from the early years in New York City for African Americans after that Great Migration. Smaller city, federal jobs, protections. In fact, what I was going to say is in the one chapter that I worked on about labor representation, Georgia, Douglas Johnson has a poem called Tomorrow's Men, which is essentially a song, and it's a union song. It's about being a union member, but it's kind of written for kids in that adulation kind of language about what they can aspire to when they become, protected and bonded together as, workers. So that might be a couple of tropes, I guess.
And A. Philip Randolph lived at 817 Q Street, not too far from Georgia Douglas's house. And of course, he, with the sleeping car porters, really put black labor on the map. Once again, Washington, D.C. Moving from the New Negro movement, we enter into the 1960s, 70s, and 80s Black Arts movement. Tell us a little bit about African American literature moving into the 1950s, 60s, and 70s? Anybody? Each of you? Give us some examples of it, and we already heard from Sydney in relation to that era. But can we talk a little bit about more historical moments in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, particularly in Washington, D.C.? Anybody?
I can talk about it more generally in that a great person to use is Gwendolyn Brooks, because she's the first African American to win the Pulitzer Prize. I think that's 1941 with Annie Allen. That is it? All right, 1950. But then, so I'm just real quick taking two jumps. Two jumps. That's Knopf, Alfred Knopf, publisher. The next leap, they take Real Cool, and Dudley Randall's like, hey, why don't we put it on a broadside? When she saw it, she was like, goodbye, Knopf. she just said goodbye to Alfred P. Knopf as a publisher. And this kind of coincides with the Fisk University Conference at the same time, where many writers there are trying to get African-American poets, in particular, Amiri Baraka is one that's like, hey, we got to quit writing in English forms. You start using language of what people normally say and speak. And Gwendolyn Brooks makes that change. And so she's a great example of someone where the black arts movement or black consciousness sort of took, she's writing subject matter that way, but Annie Allen is very different from In the Mecca. In the Mecca about the housing projects in Chicago is not the same language, nor the same, I'd say it has the same formal qualities. So I don't know if that kind of helps you in a sort of way of bridging through like what those changes might have meant to a specific writer.
Dr. Herron, anything else?
Yes, I guess I'm thinking of, I'm going back a lot earlier to Paul Laurence Dunbar, actually, and how he felt depressed that people only loved his dialect poetry and didn't love his standard English poetry. What did he say? What did he call it? A jingle and a broken tongue?
Right.
And I have to say, I'm feeling like I was mistaught so much, because I was taught that Gwendolyn Brooks was not very good in my world, and that you had to be William Butler Yeats or people like that. It was a big shock to me to come circle and get my brain working on its own to look at these works and to love them, and to finally discover the beauty of it. Well, that's what you see in Nappy here, the call and response, the African-American rhythmic integrated stuff. And when I think about Paul Laurence Dunbar feeling depressed because nobody loved his dialect poetry, I went back and read all of them and realized that the people were actually right that time. The dialect poetry had more of the soul, more of the rhythm, more of the truth than the other poetry had. And it was a big change in my life. I know I'm going back a lot earlier than you're saying.
No, that's fine.
And when I got to the 1950s, 60s, I was more into long fiction, long adult fiction. So maybe my words there about that would not be as powerful. But I felt like that period for me was what we call whoa. We have one already. You know, we've got a Ralph Ellison, and we've got a James Baldwin, and we've got a Richard Wright, and we don't need any more. And maybe one Toni Morrison late at the end. You know, that comes a little later. And and that's adult fiction. So I didn't associate it with children, but it felt depressing. It felt like a very depressing world, because it's almost as if every publisher, every standard publisher, standard white, if you want to call it that, had one person, and that's all they needed. And they didn't want any more. And some of the effects, and even though my book Nappy Hair had no trouble getting accepted, you don't know what I went through to get the illustrations, and I couldn't get a black illustrator, and I still have never had one for any of my books. I got an African American illustrator, someone who understood African American culture, and quite frankly, if the person understands African American culture, I don't care what color he is, but this person. I love this book. I wanted to sell. Keep buying it, please. But the fact is, he's a wonderful illustrator, but he assumed that the nappiest hair in the world had to go along with the darkest skin in the world, and that's not true. And he made a mistake, and I could go through and show you several mistakes he made. There's no such thing in the United States of America of a black family that everybody was the same color. There is no such thing. And that's a mistake. Also, another sort of more or less secret mistake that's somewhat generational is that the palms of the hand, it's important that you get the palms of the hand. It's not the same color as the skin. And he makes palms of her hand black. Like he doesn't know, like he never looked at anybody. Anyway, I've gone way off topic.
Hey, let me throw in real quick that another Washington writer, again, Lucille Clifton, even in those Everett Anderson poems, there's a lot of body. There's a lot of like touching. And one of the ones that I think I would need about a year to look across poems about daddies and time with daddies. And Ethelbert Miller has a great poem about his father in a collection I might talk about in a second. But Lucille Clifton does that in the Everett Anderson books, where it's like kissing daddy and hugging daddy. And then for her to kind of do that work about homage to my hips and her kind of body poems that she does quote for adult audiences, there is a line through there. And part of me wonders, I'm not a Lucille Clifton scholar per se, but wonders if that some of what you get later with Gwendolyn Brooks, even in her works for kids, and some of Lucille Clifton's work, is not a reaction to the Black Power movement in the putting of women second. And I can't forget the exact quote, but it's by an African-American writer, poet, who said something like, "I didn't want to walk 2 steps behind." So
That could have been me. That's why I left Howard University in 1967. In the midst of the when Black Power essentially took over the student body, and we were asked to walk 2 steps behind, I transferred out.
Really?
Really. That's the reason why I ended up at white schools instead of black schools. Wow. That's the reason.
Speaking of Howard, don't forget, we got Zora Neale Hurston went to Howard. Sterling Brown, of course, with his vernacular English. Tell us more about Howard's importance and Sterling and Zora and the way they used their language. Tell us about that and why that's important, please.
Well, love my Zora. Why it's important. It's not that important. I only take the name of her characters and put it in my novel. That's all. I have one of my characters in my current novel is named Jane, and I took it from Janie, from Their Eyes Were Watching God. That's all. I wanted some symbol of our early development, because we realized she had to. Well, it feels like it, because I wasn't with her, that she had to write her book without having a model before her. I had her, but she didn't have her. She didn't have herself. She had her own head and what she was seeing, and managed it on her own. What a masterpiece! I'm Jewish, by the way. Some of my ancestors were kicked out of Spain during the Inquisition, along with the Muslims, and Jews were kicked out of Spain in 1492. And on Passover and different times, I read Zora Neale Hurston's version of what really happened with Moses, man of the mountain, because of the rhythm and power of her speech is like a magnificent masterpiece of retelling or extension of the world we live in. I think she got that black woman walking with those shoes and the red dress. I'm telling you, who is that woman in the red dress? Anyway,
I was going to throw in a couple other kind of important children's lit writers, only because you could think of them in like 3 different genre or issue-oriented ways, which is Elizabeth Acevedo, who's I think she's in Philly now, teaching.
GW grad.
Okay, and then so both poetry and YA fiction, and then when I was speaking with you about children's literature, Aaron Magruder in Boondocks is something that you probably really do want to investigate. That's your, and I'm just going to say this for a couple of reasons. And again, I'm like the good idea person, but then I have to teach like 120 people, so I don't get the opportunity to follow up on some of these, but I would love other people to think about, as PG County is it was the most affluent or richest African-American county in the United States, how would that affect the sort of suburban look that Aaron Magruder brings out in Boondocks? Because when I watch Boondocks, I see this really like kind of observational child, but in an environment where he's got to be like, oh, this is not going to be like Greenwood, South Carolina. When I go across the street or into these different cul-de-sacs or whatever, it's a different world for his children, you know, his child characters to inhabit. And then the other person that I was thinking about is Jason Reynolds, and you know his work and the novels in verse, and I think they have a placard out there like, you know, it was a road for him to get there, and he is just really taken off. And so the three of them, I think, provide a kind of like a way of looking at some different ways that children's materials, writers, makers, creators embrace not only the subject, but also how they're going to deliver it, whether it be through a comic format or some, you know, rhyme, rhythm, spoken word elements, or if it's going to be spoken word, Latin Poet-X. Her YA novel, the one I read about being into the fire, is about a young Latina girl who is an excellent cook and is aiming to get this scholarship or to work in this one restaurant. And it's, as far as I mean, I've read a lot of YA fiction because that's what they make me do, you know, and it is like the tensions that go on in there and the worries and the anxieties. I'm like, man, to me, it brought me back to my own, where I was just like working at Roy Rogers and hoping I could save enough money for school, and it's like, will this work? Will this work? And that's the feeling you get from it, and I think it's probably one of the reasons she's pretty popular, you know.
In fact, I would like to add just one thing about Zora Neale Hurston. We're here at Trinity College, and my mother graduated from Trinity College in 1973. I think this is my first time back since then. I lost her in 2020. She would be 100 years old in 2024. And one of my warm memories, she died in my arms. One of my warm memories of her giggling of mules and men in the bed, on her deathbed. Zora Neale Hurston took her laughing. And it was just a nice memory. So that it stretches back beyond our generations to the earlier folks, my mother.
We have another 5 or 7 minutes, and then we're going to turn it to you for questions, comments, and answers.
Let me inject.
Yeah.
Let me inject, because I appreciate the conversation we're having, but I also want to bring it back to the area that we're here for. And I also want to do two things. One is to say that we are looking at authors who create literature for children. We're not looking at children who write literature. That might be another conference. We're not looking at Hispanic writers. That might be another conference. We're looking at African American authors of children's literature. And we're looking at that period, late 1960s to the present. So I want to try to, you know, I'm supposed to be the respondent, but I'm jumping in.
No, please do.
Because I think I would like to jump in. This is just Janetta, okay? I'm sorry. This is just how I am. And so the thing is that we want to also understand some of the discussion that the panel members have brought in, like they brought in the Brownies. The Brownies book was a magazine that was started by W.E.B. Du Bois, and the editor was Jessie Redmond Fawcett, who was actually an instructor here at the Dunbar High School, used to be called M Street High School, really fabulous high school. They brought in the talk about the work progress administration. Sterling Brown was at one point the Negro editor in that period, and so he was responsible for making sure that there was a study going on and that writers, black writers during that period that you all are talking about, had an opportunity to participate. Sterling Brown, as a result, did his work, a lot of his work was in the vernacular, the rural kind of work, the rural language and everything. And some people think that his work was not for children, but in fact, one of the things that Dr. Herron talks about is the Homer's Iliad, and there are people who compare what Sterling was doing at the time to that writing, to that kind of folkloric epic writing. And that is the stuff that children also were engaged in rather. And so I wanted to just kind of get us back. One thing, though, that I take issue with this panel on right now, and so we might have that and bring in the audience to this conversation, when the moderator asked, well, how far does children's literature, black children's literature go? And I never heard anyone say, Sydney, it goes back to the continent. Black people were writing, black people were creating oral literature, which is as valid as written literature, before they were enslaved. Let's not forget that. And so consequently, what happened when they became enslaved, white people want to tell you, we didn't write, we didn't read, we did all of that in various countries on the continent. So when you want to trace that history, let's don't stop at the shores of North America or South America or any other place where black people were enslaved. Let's go to the homeland, to the continent, to the heart of civilization. And that is where, and so I know somebody's going to disagree with me, okay, but that's what we're here for, to have this kind of conversation.
No, but, yeah.
That's why.
Janetta, I stopped at the shore because I thought I was overstepping my boundary.
Oh, don't
But I
overstep.
absolutely don't stop at the boundary. It drives me crazy. I love the work about 1619, but I was here long before 1619. I'm sorry, folks. I went all the way back. And when I teach, actually teach nappy hair to my students at Howard University, I show the patterns of epic poetry, African epic poetry, African oral epic poetry, all the way back to the griots in Africa. So I don't stop there. I'm sorry, I didn't say it.
No,
but
I know
it's
you
there.
don't stop there, but that's why I'm
Yeah,
kind of getting us
make us say it, exactly.
getting us on the page.
Yes, because, and I actually helped translate one of the Pearl, P-E-U-L epics, oral epics, that was recorded back on these weird little discs they used to have back in 1920s and 30s. I found patterns from there that my uncle used. I'm sure that we're descended from griots or something, and there are patterns also I found them in some of Michael Jackson's songs. The same pattern going all the way back to Africa.
Exactly.
Janetta, that's why you're up here.
Yeah, it pushes.
We need you, Janetta. Stay opinionated and angry and energetic. Publishing. Where did black authors publish if they couldn't publish in the mainstreams? Where did they publish? And really more, also importantly, where did they distribute? You can get something published, but how do you get it out there? Anybody, guys?
Open. You have an answer? I'm sorry. I shouldn't be pointing.
The microphone over here is working in the.
Well, it looks like we've gone to Q&A. That's fine.
She looked like she had something
We're
to
going to go with the flow. Come on, Mike is here. Let's go to Q&A and comments. and then we'll ask Janetta once again to do more commentary, if that's okay?
Okay.
All right. Yes, ma'am.
Hi.
And give us your name, please.
Hi, I'm Karen Bolding. I'm actually
Take the mic and,
Okay. Is it on? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Karen Bolding, and my sister Kathy Anderson. She and I write children's books, and we've been writing for years. I also self-publish other writers, and so they come with me. I get the whole process done, but they end up self-publishing their work. And so we've self-published all of our work because, one, the big publishers aren't going to take us. We go to bookstores, they won't take us because we're independent writers. And so that's why we can't get a high volume of distribution. We sell our works because our books are environmentally and agriculturally related. We sell a lot at farmers markets. There's, even after we leave here, we're going to an African American book fest. And there's another one at the end of the month. That's where we're able to sell our books. But in the mainstream, it's hard. And even with the school system, I try to get my books in the school system. I work for the school system. They still haven't reviewed it. We did a presentation a couple of weeks ago. We did the research. Prince George's County Schools, 50% Black, 50%, 40% Hispanic. All of the books are geared towards white students. It's only 3% in the school. So 96% of the books were for white students, white characters, white illustrators. Some of the books were white writers, white illustrators. The little kids look like little pickaninnies. And we told them, this does not represent us. And so the one book that had a white author, black illustrator, her book represented what our students look like. And so we called that out in front of a bunch of white teachers at a conference. And so that's what we're dealing with. And so I have authors that get caught up with hybrid publishing, spending boatloads of money to get their book done, and they end up with like 10 books. You can't make a profit doing that. So I actually highly recommend self-publishing because we get to control the whole process.
Can I ask you real quick about, so what, do you guys work with digital books, or, you know what I mean, like PDF or some kind of
All of our books are
platform?
print because the kids want them in their hands.
Hands, right?
And our buyers are diverse. We get buyers that don't even speak English,
Right.
but they buy the books for their children who are in school learning
Right.
English. And so I don't do digital books for children's books. I don't recommend them because we want to get the kids off of the media.
Right.
And all of our books about outdoors, we want to get our kids back outdoors.
Gotcha.
And so I stay away from digital for children's books, and I highly recommend that my authors do the same.
Yeah, I don't have a dog in this fight. I'm trying to find out at some point if, and as she just said, developmentally, it's probably not a great idea to be going digitally when you're trying to create a tactile body relationship, you know?
Okay, hello. I am Elder Dr. Jacqueline Norris. I wasn't going to say anything. Prince George's County have a lot of Washingtonians. And we instruct our children on Black history because we grew up. Now, whether or not it is advertised, which we don't do, there are a lot. As far as the library, you have now a Black, for the first time, librarian. So therefore, we do those things. It's just a secret society, okay? That's all I'm gonna say. So don't say if you don't understand DC process, because my grandparents have been here since 1800s. So there is, and then the Black teacher movement here. So when you say things, say according to your environment, not the entire. That's all I needed to say.
Thank you, thank you. We got another 5 or 10 minutes for your dialogue with us, and then we're gonna ask Janetta to give us more commentary. Then we'll ask for closing comments of our panelists. Keep going. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, my name is Christina. Good morning, everyone. I'm just tickled by all of the opinions and the colorful speech here. And we're just having a very lovely conversation. I did want to raise a point and opinion about when we're talking about when children's literature first began in this, because the reason why I didn't take issue with the statement that it began with children, with the first black child scream in the soil is because I know that we're here for an African American conference. This is an African American conversation. And I'm very sensitive to the fact that when we're having conversations about black people, African people, diasporans, we have to distill exactly what it is that we're talking about and define that in the moment. So I think that it's very easy for those types of conversations to become confused and for us to get a little bit muddled there. But I took it as more so us talking about when our literature started in this soil, in this country. And that can go back to when was America founded as a nation. So I do definitely appreciate the points that were raised. I think that they were very, very important. And I'm curious as to what the exact question was. Was it about black literature or black children's literature, or was it about African children's literature, African American? So it's like a comment and a question at the same time.
Thank you. I
Good,
wish we
thank
had
you.
more time to talk.
Anybody win, Dr. Herron?
All I can say is I wish we had more time for a conversation. We need to go off and have coffee and talk a bit. Because a lot of things that goes way back. Because I was having the same reason why I didn't go beyond the boundaries, because I thought, oh, African American, but it drives me crazy. I felt confined. So I'm glad you brought up the.
I can tell you that in the children's lit kind of community, one of the things that we talk about is the privilege that adults give themselves, that they're the ones giving kids all the knowledge that they need about the world. And that's something that you really have to kind of examine in some ways. And I cannot think of a more important sort of topic that we don't control than when you get to like imagery in film and advertising. You know, that's a great example where I can say something to a child, but the repeated image over, 3, 4, 5 times a week, I'm not even in competition, right? So that's.
We'll have a conversation later today about illustrations and that kind of thing with respect to books, children's literature. So we're going to talk about illustrations, images, and all of that with the historical perspective of some of what Dr. Herron was talking about and the struggles that she had, where the hand is what is the same color as the...
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that comment and question. Yeah, we have many, many subject matters on the panels all day long, so please stay tuned. Yes, ma'am. And please introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Janet Bruns. I am here because I have a daughter. She's 4. I love children's literature, and also I am curious. One thing I do see when I'm trying to introduce my daughter to diverse books is that a lot of the minority we don't intersect together. We're not curious enough about each other, and that's why I'm here over. And so my comment and question to the panel is this: is that you guys touched on the children's literature has 2 audiences. One is for the adults, and then one is for children. And I enjoy all of the diverse, different books, and I'm trying to learn as much as possible because this isn't what I had growing up, all the different cultures and learning. However, my daughter, who is 4, I can see that she is rejecting some of these books, and I don't know. I have an idea why. Is that sometimes perhaps they're too serious, perhaps the art is very different. And so at one hand, I do appreciate being able to learn, to get drawn in, and to have all of that rich background within these books. But my question is, how do you draw in your other audience, which is the age group that is appropriate for those books? Thank you.
Wow. Yes, I remember.
Thank you.
I thank you again, indeed. Two images come up. I was in California talking about my book, Nappy Hair, and there were no black people around me. They were all asking questions. And one woman, a white woman, was asking me, what does this book have to do with me, kind of thing. And a little white kid with all this flowing blondish hair coming up said, Well, it says right here, basically, that my hair may be too curly and not straight enough, but my mother loves me anyway. That's what it means. And basically, this little kid, this 4-year-old, taught the adult. That's one image that comes to me. Another one is I went out to Kenilworth neighborhood here in Washington, D.C., and I started a program of creative writing in the school, and I held up a copy of Nappy Hair, and it was all African American students, and one little boy said, why should we read that book? You got a monkey on the cover. And he says, and I don't want to read that book, I want to write a book. I went home and revamped the whole program to be where we start with their stories. And they said they didn't want any books, they wanted to write their own, so we started writing our own books. After about a month and a half, 2 months, then they said, okay, we want to read other people's books now. And it was really interesting. And that they really, in both cases, they're children teaching grown-ups. And Politics and Prose and Busboys and Poets invited us in at the end of the semester, and each kid picked out a book. A notice to all you bookstore owner people out there that this is a good idea. Anyway, I'm just saying that sometimes I start with the kid. In both cases, it was the kid that helped, not the grown-up.
Thank you. 2 more questions, then we go to Janetta for commentary, and then we'll have closing comments. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, my name is Monique Russell, and I'm a public school administrator with a specialty in early childhood. So children's literature is really important to me on a number of levels, including being a mom of 2 young children. But one thing I've been actively working on at my school is to ensure that our classroom libraries really do feature diverse books and books that can act as both mirrors and windows, like Sydney mentioned earlier. And something that I'm curious about, I'm glad that you mentioned Elizabeth Acevedo. And for folks who may not be familiar with her, she's an Afro-Latino writer who writes more for older children, like the teenage set. But I'm wondering, thinking about that a lot of our Black community also have ancestry and connections to Caribbean culture, and what the Caribbean influence in children's literature has been. And I'm thinking back from Langston Hughes' book about children in Haiti, Popo and Fefina, all the way up to Elizabeth Acevedo.
Thank you, thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. Introduce yourself again,
once
please.
again, I'm Elder Dr. Jacqueline Norris. I want to respond to you. One of the things that those who did not come over here for free, a lot of times when others who come over here and can identify where they came from, it's like those who were enslaved are erased, like their historical movement in this country is not valid. So those individuals who are writing from pain. And even though they may have been stolen, they are writing from enslavement. So it is not appropriate to do what others do to eliminate those who made it possible for others. And then the other thing that I want to say, that when we deal with pulling in others into something that happened in Washington, D.C., with those individuals, others are important, but first go with those who created this country. And that's all I got to say, because they were enslaved. They were free labor. So do not erase my ancestral people who came. I'm just saying my concept of what you said. This is what I thought this was about. This is why Trinity, I'm alumni. I look at language, culture, women, but it's important to emphasize where I come from in Washington, D.C., from the 1800s, when my grandpapa was stolen, but was classified as a professional preacher because they look white, and I'll say no more.
This is the passion of children's literature. Janetta. Go ahead, please.
About your question about the Caribbean writers, as an educator.
You're not close enough.
Is that better? For kids, because I use it with my own kids, and I use it in the Children's Lit. I get the teachers to use the thing. So the poetry website, it's the magazine Poetry, has a part that's for kids. It's their video poems. So one is a poem by, is it County Cullen? And Ziggy Marley reads it, and it's all in like watercolors. It's beautiful. There's a poem by Garcia Lorca. So there's different poems there, and I think that the poem by County Cullen really captures a nice intersection in the Harlem Renaissance between Caribbean writers and African American writers who migrated north. So just to say there are some resources that way, it's something, and the kids seem to like the video and the colors and Ziggy Marley's patois.
Thank you for bringing that in. Jonah, and guys, I'm pushing us only because we got to end in about 7 minutes because of other panelists. Janetta, give us some more commentary.
Just before Brown versus Board of Education, some of you may not remember this. I'm not that old either. Let me just correct you. Okay, but one of the things that I did when I came to Washington, D.C. from California, because at that point I had been living in California and I came here, was that I wanted to know the history of this city, Chocolate City. I wanted to know where people had come from, what the history, the art, the culture, and everything. I am a person who believes one has to be grounded in one's environment, in one's present space, in the time in which you're here, and to reach back and bring that information to the time in which you're here, and to leap forward using that current information to anticipate what you can do in the space that you're in. That is why we're here. We are here because in the late 1970s, Rose Susan Dorsey, Sheila Kreider, and myself created the Institute for the Preservation and Study of African American Writing. We wanted to understand what was happening. Some of you have the essay in your program to explain to you more thoroughly why we're here. But as I was doing the research for this project, I recalled the study that was done by Kenneth Clark and Mamie Clark. It was a study looking at the children, looking at black children with white dolls. And every time in this study, the black children chose the white dolls as the prettier dolls. And that wasn't the whole basis of the ruling, but it certainly moved the judges, and it certainly moved the lawyers, the legal defense team's lawyers who had been on this for years and years and years. And so that's when we came to understand the negative impact that racism, institutional racism, was having on our children. It is similar things with books. It's funny because Sydney's mother, Lucille, was involved in the education department, the U.S. education department, and she would go around to look at the books and to research these books that these kids were getting. And what Lucille says is that I began to realize there weren't these books even for my own children. And so why we're here today is because these books are still important. They might be even more important now because we think we've arrived. We ain't arrived. We're still going. We're still getting there. And so we in DC, we have a rich history. And we can talk about all the writers, there are many black writers in this country who are doing great jobs, fantastic jobs. But what we have dedicated ourselves to today, in this space, in this moment in time, is to talk about the writers who lived and worked here and contributed to the history and culture of this city and to its advancement, and their work is still contributing to that advancement. And so when you look at Sharon Bell Mathis and Lucille Clifton and Ethelbert Miller and Eloise Greenfield and Joy Jones, and in the back, my man Kwame Alexander, these are people who are advancing us, putting us and our children. And if a book doesn't appeal to your child, then you have to find the writer who can appeal to your child. And that's what you will understand today. In the course of this conversation, I hope, what you should be looking for. You should be looking for a black doll or a colored doll in the form of a book that actually does elevate your child, makes your child feel part, and teaches your child about their wealth, their value, their history, their culture. That's what we want to do. We want to elevate those writers. We read the names of some of those writers. You'll see some of those writers. But DC has a rich literary history. We are not going to ignore it today. Not while I'm here.
Perfect. Thank you, Janetta. 1 minute, because we're running out of time. Can we have the mic, please? We're running out of time, and please, 1 minute from Dr. Heron and Dr. Yarbrough. Thank
You can take mine. No, saying you can take my minute.
I can take your minute. I thought you were going to conclude all of this stuff. I wish I had time to tell you all the fights I had to go through. It looks like my books were not published by small presses. My books were published by big presses. I had a hell of a time getting some of the things done there. I had to you have to decide where your barrier is. I'm looking at you and saying it's better to go with self-publishing sometimes rather than with Random House, because then you can get what you want and what you really look like and all that. And I just wanted to say that don't think of self-publishing as, oh, gee, I'm taking second best.
Right.
You may be taking first best if you go with self-publishing sometimes. At least that's where I'm going now. I have a contract for my next book with Random House, which I'm ignoring it because they don't want to do what I want to do.
Good for you.
You need
I don't think you really need much more from me. I kind of yapped the whole time, but thank you so much for listening, to us, and I hope some of this gets you to thinking, especially when you're thinking about books for people that are in your lives. I think that's the biggest deal. And then I just might close by saying, if you think that access to having different kinds of books where a kid doesn't like the book you might like, but's going to pick another book that might have some of the same values you want, then you need to get on school boards and you need to get on library boards. That's the way.
Thank you. Thank you, Colivia. Thank you, Wynn. Especially thank you, Janetta. And most importantly, thank you. Guys, you are the foot soldiers, the organizers, and the leaders of preserving, protecting, and promoting African American children's literature. You are it. We thank you for being here today. Thank you.